Well, I'm the Republican candidate for state attorney in 2024. My name is Seth Hyman, and I'm running because I want to protect our community. I was a prosecutor in that office 9 years ago. I worked under Jeff Ashton. And when I started working there, the vast majority of the people that I worked with had worked for Lawson Lamar. Now, I grew up in Maitland. My family moved to the area in 1978 when I was 2 years old. So State Attorney Lawson Lamar and his predecessor, Robert Egan, were the state attorneys that protected me when I was a little kid. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to become an assistant state attorney 9 years ago was because I believe in public service. And I think that it's very important that people are held accountable for their actions. My parents lived in the same house that I grew up in for 43 years. They just downsized and moved to Seminole County. But, this community is the community that I love, that I've been a part of, and it's home.
Awesome. I'm going to mute my mic while you answer the question because I do have a dog and sometimes she'll bark at things and noises. So
I also have a dog, so
yeah.
I understand.
It's a struggle sometimes, but okay. So what are you passionate about when it comes to this position and, why you want to do this?
I mean, I'm very passionate about protecting victims and victims' rights. When I was a prosecutor, I was in the domestic violence unit for a period of time, and a big part of that is fighting for victims' rights. And actually, as a defense attorney, which for the last 5 to 6 years, I've actually run my own criminal defense practice. All I do is criminal defense now. And so for the last 9 years, I've exclusively practiced criminal law, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney. So I have that broad view. But as a defense attorney, I represented a victim of a very heinous, serious crime where the father of her children tried to kill her multiple times. And she could not get Monique Worrell's office to file charges, no matter how hard she tried. She called multiple times a day. She waited in the lobby for hours, and she was just told to wait. And so those are the kinds of experiences that I've had personally, and other prosecutors, other criminal defense attorneys, we talk, and the management of that office under both Monique Worrell and Aramis Ayala, her predecessor was so horrible. Everything just took forever, was delayed, and justice delayed is justice denied, regardless. And so I think that fighting for victims' rights is the number one thing that the state attorney should be doing, and protecting the community, analyzing cases to determine, can you go forward on a prosecution? And then should you go forward on a prosecution?
Awesome. So kind of going into, the current state attorney, what has she done or not done that you would do differently?
The state attorney, Monique Worrell, that was just removed, and her predecessor, Aramis Ayala, they had very similar policies and procedures. They had unnecessary middle management. They were overly lenient on people that were convicted of crimes. It seemed to me, in some of my experiences, that some of the prosecutors were looking for reasons not to file charges and not to go forward on cases, rather than my prosecutorial philosophy. And when I was a prosecutor, I was always looking to find out any way possible, of course, within the law, that I could go forward. And if that meant that I needed to go over and above the four corners of my formal responsibility, then I did that. If I saw a gap in my case and I needed to call the law enforcement officer, or I needed to call FDLE, or I needed to call probation in another state to make sure that they knew that someone on my desk had violated probation, and I wanted to get them violated and make sure that they remained in jail so they didn't pose a risk to anyone in my community. I want to make sure I was a really big advocate of being tough with DUI offenses when I was a prosecutor. And that's because many people are killed from drunk drivers. My parents live here. My brother lives here. All of my childhood friends live here, and I want to protect them. And so I want to make sure that I institute a very advanced regimen of training in criminal law specifically. I think there's always been a lack of adequate training in the office, and there needs to be a training every single week. And it's not just a training about ancillary issues. That was my experience. It needs to be these young prosecutors are coming out of law school just like anyone coming out of law school, and they don't really know the ins and outs of practicing law. And it's up to the state attorney to create a training regimen that's regular, that relates to preparing them for how they're going to do their job. How do you prosecute a theft crime? How do you prosecute a battery? How do you prosecute a burglary? They need to learn that. And it's not just give them a case file, send them to court, and have them figure it out. That's not responsible. And that's not the way it's going to work with me. And just wrapping this up, I want to make sure I have a very good relationship with law enforcement. And I've already done my best to reach out to law enforcement, and I've had very good conversations with law enforcement. I think that it's essential that all of those trainings, law enforcement are invited in, because they're cops, they're not lawyers, but we ask them as a society to go out and execute the laws on the streets. And the more criminal law education they have, the better they'll be able to do their job. And the law enforcement and police and prosecutors should work together. They're two sides of the same coin. And that was the biggest problem with both Aramis Ayala and Monique Worrell. They were effectively at war with law enforcement. And that's the opposite of what needs to happen.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So what are your, I apologize. What are your thoughts on her suspension?
Well, my thoughts on her suspension are, first and foremost, I am glad Monique Worrell is not the state attorney in Orange and Osceola County today. We are safer because of that. I will, defer any comments on the legalities of it because I don't practice in that area of law. I believe the governor has the legal authority to suspend a person who is the state attorney because they fall within the executive branch. I think that will end up being resolved either in the Florida State Senate or by the courts, or both.
Great, thank you. What are your thoughts on the fact that she said, during her press conference yesterday, she basically said that she's planning on running still?
Yes, so I have been running against Monique Worrell for the last 6 months. I am the first viable Republican candidate to ever run for state attorney in Orange and Osceola County. There was one person who ran in 2008 who had never been a prosecutor before. So I have the experience in court as being a tough prosecutor, and I was a tough prosecutor for 3 years. I would like to say and remind people, Monique Worrell was never a prosecutor. She never had a docket. She never had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime. And she never had to convince a judge to put someone behind bars. Her background is that she was a public defender for a couple of years. And that is a completely different perspective on the criminal justice system, public safety system, however you want to call it. And so I have been running against Monique Worrell for 6 months, and I will continue to run against Monique Worrell until Election Day next fall. I will be on the ballot. I am going to win this race. I'm going to be a state attorney that follows the law, because that's necessary for defending victims and protecting the community.
Great, thank you. So going back to her suspension, why, so for someone who doesn't really understand everything that goes on in this field, and just, someone that would be watching at home, can you explain to them why this is such a big deal that she was suspended? And DeSantis is saying she neglected her duty to faithfully prosecute crime. Can you kind of talk about why, if they're like, well, what's the big deal? So some people would say that, like, how would you kind of talk about why that's a big deal?
Well, a failure to prosecute crime is a huge deal. We have seen what happens in cities on the West Coast, like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles. All of those cities were once great places to visit. They had thriving economies, and they were pleasant. And now the first thing that people think of when referencing those cities is crime and homelessness. And we cannot risk a tarnishing of our city or region or state's reputation whatsoever, because a lot of our economy is based on tourism. And if tourists believe that Florida is not safe, if tourists believe that Orange County and Osceola County are not safe, that's going to dramatically affect our economy. And it is a big deal, just first and foremost, not because of the economy, but because we're talking about people who have had crimes committed against them. This is someone who's walking down the street and someone sticks a gun in their face and robs them. This is someone who's in the sanctity of their home and someone breaks in and breaches the peace of their life. And in the future, even after arrest, that person is going to never feel as safe as they did beforehand. So this is about justice. This is about justice for the victims and making sure that the community has confidence in the state attorney, who is the head prosecutor, one of the chief law enforcement officers of Orange and Osceola County, in addition to the sheriffs. The community needs to know that the state attorney and the sheriffs are going to make them safe, keep them safe, do everything they can to make them feel like they can walk down the street and not be at risk. People want to move to Central Florida and Orlando and Orange and Osceola counties because it's a wonderful place to live. That's why we're one of the top places for people to visit and move. People build houses, they sell houses, they build businesses, they start families, and we need to keep that happening. What was occurring under Monique Worrell's watch and Aramis Ayala, both of whom were George Soros funded prosecutors. George Soros is a billionaire, and he's funded a lot of the prosecutors on the West Coast. I believe that the state attorney should reflect the will of the people of the community, right? The state attorney is elected to be the representative of the people in the space of public safety. So that's why I've been going to a lot of public events, farmers markets, jazz festivals, 5Ks, any of those things, because I want to talk to people about what makes them feel safe. I believe that Monique Worrell and Aramis Ayala, they're two peas in a pod. They were leading based on their own personal political philosophy, and they were imposing that political philosophy on our community. They weren't representing our community. And that's not the appropriate role for state attorney. If she wants to run for, legislature or Congress, by all means, go try to change the laws up there. But the state attorney has to execute the law as it's written.
Perfect. All right. So next, I was reading a quote from you. I believe it was on your website. You said, "I intend to do everything I can to stop the revolving jailhouse doors that let repeat and violent offenders back out on our streets too soon." And I know that that's kind of one of the points that DeSantis was trying to make. I read, there was a 40-page document that came out yesterday, and it seems like that's she's a little soft on crime, and you've said publicly that you don't want people to be back out on the streets too soon. Can you elaborate on that point?
Sure. I don't think people should be back out onto the streets too soon, because the vast majority of people that are accused of crime are eligible for bond. The vast majority of people that are convicted of crime will get out of jail or prison at some point. That is a reality. And that's a reality that makes America great. You know, I'm a criminal defense attorney by trade now. And what I tell people is that we have our Constitution and we have our constitutional protections because back when the founders were writing the document, they came from an environment where in England, if you are accused of committing a crime, you get thrown in the dungeon for the rest of your life without a trial, without an opportunity to defend yourself. So one of the things that makes this country great is that we have due process. And so the thing is that there is such a thing as prosecutorial discretion. That happens at every phase, right? The state attorney is only ethically supposed to go forward with a prosecution if they have a reasonable likelihood that they will get a guilty verdict at a jury trial. And that means a unanimous verdict from 6 people, some cases more than 6. But so the thing is that the state attorney has to make a determination before filing charges whether the evidence they have is strong enough to likely convict at trial. But if the state attorney doesn't feel that they have the evidence, it's their responsibility to touch base and work with law enforcement to make sure that they get that evidence collected. You know, there are tools that the state attorney has. The state attorney has their own investigators that are former law enforcement who can collect sworn statements. There are plenty of partners throughout law enforcement in Florida that if the state attorney has a good relationship with them, they will want to work with them. Monique Worrell and Osceola both ran on the premise that the entire system was broken, that law enforcement are not to be trusted or incompetent. I strongly disagree with all of those notions. And they wanted to use the power of the state attorney to kind of control how crimes are addressed in the criminal justice system. And so what Monique Worrell has done, in my opinion, is too many cases are not filed on. Too many cases, when they're filed on, are dropped. And then too many cases that do enter a plea or go to trial and get a conviction, when the facts of that case and the criminal history of that defendant are considered, when those, in certain cases, when they should be put behind bars, too often, because of her own philosophy that's really anti-incarceration generally, she would instruct her assistant state attorneys who are in the courtroom to be lenient with them and put them on probation or even sometimes community control. And I've heard this story many times. And to be perfectly honest, many assistant state attorneys quit that office to go work for other state attorneys' offices in neighboring counties like Seminole, Brevard, Lake County, Polk County, because they want to be prosecutors. They want to perform that public service, but they felt that Monique Worrell's perspective and her policies were effectively tying both of their hands behind their back. So they quit. You know, I mean, that's unacceptable. We're losing so many people. There's a gigantic brain drain, and you know, it's a public service job. So people always make the claim, and Monique Worrell has, that she can't keep people there because she can't pay them enough. But the reality is that no assistant state attorney was ever paid well in the history of mankind. You know, if you talk to people that were assistant state attorneys in 1985 that are now esteemed judges or were the heads of offices, they will tell you that their starting salary was like $15,000. But the reality is, like teachers, people become prosecutors and public defenders because they want to serve the public. Now, if you have an office that is run poorly and it's chaos, and you're not teaching young attorneys how to be great trial attorneys, and you're making their lives difficult, you're not helping them, and it's not fun to work there. People will quit in 1 year or 6 months instead of staying and working there 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, what's the point in having the turnover? Because then you just have to kind of keep training, people, if they don't want to stay there, if they're not learning and growing, then, so that's a good point that you make about the training. I liked that. Okay, let's see. So DeSantis just appointed Andrew Bain to fill that spot. So, if he chooses to run, I guess he would have to, like announce that or whatever. But, what are your thoughts there if he decides to join the race?
I'm running for state attorney in 2024, and I will be on the ballot. I don't know if Andrew Bain is a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat. So if he does decide to run, perhaps there will be a primary, either a Republican primary or a Democratic primary, or perhaps there will be a three-way general election. And we'll see. But right now, we know that there are 2 candidates for state attorney in Orange and Osceola County next year at this time. One is me, Seth Hyman. The other, as we learned yesterday, is Monique Worrell. And so I'm running against Monique Worrell.